I am Nora, 34 years old, and I just bought my family's $5 million estate for less than half its value. 2 years ago, my parents sat across a polished mahogany table and laughed as my name was legally erased from the family trust. My mother looked me dead in the eye and called me her biggest disappointment. My sister's husband offered to let me rent the old gardener's shed out back. They were utterly convinced they had financially ruined me. They had no idea they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to tear their false empire to the ground. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who underestimated your worth and tried to use you. The air inside the plush conference room of the law firm was suffocatingly dry. Mr. Higgins, the estate lawyer, adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the freshly printed documents. He cleared his throat, avoiding my gaze entirely. Effective immediately, he read his voice painfully loud in the quiet room. The entirety of the Crestwood estate, including the primary residence and the surrounding 50 acres, is transferred solely to Sydney and Jamal. Nora is hereby entirely removed as a beneficiary of the trust. I sat perfectly still. Across the table, my mother Brenda let out a soft, satisfied sigh. She smoothed down the skirt of her designer dress, a dress I knew for a fact she had purchased on a credit card carrying a 20% interest rate. "You have to understand, Nora," she said, her voice dripping with that fake syrupy sweetness she used whenever she was about to say something incredibly vicious. "You have always been a financial liability to this family. Sydney made the right choices. She married a provider. You insisted on playing business with that little startup of yours instead of settling down. We need to protect the family legacy from your unpredictable income." "My unpredictable income," I replied, unable to stop a bitter laugh from escaping my throat. "Mom, my company analyzes distressed property markets. I literally buy and fix the mistakes of people who mismanage their money. People exactly like you." "Do not speak to your mother that way, my father," Thomas muttered. He sat at the end of the table, deeply concerned with his status at the country club, yet acting like a complete coward when it came to his wife and his golden child. He did not say a single word to actually defend me. I looked at my sister Sydney, who was busy examining her fresh manicure. She was 31, the undisputed golden child, and she had never paid a single utility bill in her entire life. Next to her sat her husband Jamal. Jamal was 33, an arrogant African-American man who proudly called himself a crypto entrepreneur and angel investor on social media. The reality was that he lived entirely off my parents. Jamal leaned back in his heavy leather chair and kicked his expensive loafers right onto the polished mahogany table. He adjusted his cuffs, making sure the gold Rolex caught the light. It was a watch my father had bought him for his birthday just 3 months ago. "Do not look so grim, Nora," Jamal laughed, flashing a wide, mocking grin. "Tell you what, since Sydney and I are officially the lords of the manor now, I can cut you a deal. We are going to turn the old gardener's shed into a guest house. It does not have heating yet, but I will let you rent it for $1,000 a month. You know, to support your little real estate hobby." A hot wave of pure anger washed over me, but I refused to let them see me break. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "A financial liability," I repeated slowly, locking eyes with my mother. "That is very interesting. Let us talk about the family legacy. Who exactly do you think paid the $50,000 property tax bill last November when Dad's business account was overdrawn?" My mother bristled, her face flushing red. "That was a temporary cash flow issue." "And the roof," I continued, my voice steady and cold. "When the slate roof caved in over the West Wing 2 years ago, Jamal claimed his crypto assets were tied up in a locked liquidity pool. Sydney said she was too stressed to deal with contractors. I wrote the $80,000 check from my personal savings to fix it. I have spent the last 6 years keeping that crumbling mansion standing while all of you paraded around playing old money." Jamal scoffed and took his feet off the table. He leaned in, pointing a finger at me. "You lived there too. You were just paying your fair share. Now the adults are taking over the asset. You should be thanking us for taking the burden off your hands. My new token launch is happening next month. I'm going to double the value of that estate in a year. I looked at Jamal, then at Sydney, and finally at my parents. They were entirely delusional. They lived in a world of social media aesthetics and leased luxury cars, completely blind to the actual mechanics of wealth. I knew exactly how fragile their financial house of cards really was. If you are so confident, then I will leave you to it, I said quietly. I reached into my purse and pulled out the heavy brass master keys to Crestwood Estate. I dropped them onto the glass table. The metal hit the surface with a loud final clack. Consider the burden lifted, I told them. The winter utility bills are due on the 15th. The commercial boiler in the basement needs its pressure valves serviced by the end of the month, or the pipes will freeze and burst. But since Jamal is an angel investor, I am sure he has it completely under control. Mr. Higgins pushed a final document toward me to sign, acknowledging the change in the trust. I picked up the pen, signed my name with a smooth, sharp flourish, and stood up. Good luck, I said. You are going to need it. I did not wait for a response. I turned and walked out of the conference room, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I walked out of the building and stepped into the cool afternoon air of the city. The noise of the traffic washed over me, a sharp contrast to the suffocating silence of the law firm. For years I had let my desire for their approval chain me to that massive, decaying property. I had let them drain my time and my energy just to hear them call me family. But sitting in that office, the last thread of obligation snapped. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the parking garage. As the doors slid shut, cutting off the view of the lobby, I pulled my phone from my pocket. I opened Vanguard Management, the proprietary estate management application I had coded myself. It controlled everything at Crestwood: the security gates, the smart thermostats, the vendor payment schedules, and the cloud storage for all the historical maintenance records. My thumb hovered over the administrative dashboard. They wanted me out of the family. It was time to give them exactly what they asked for. I did not press the delete button in the elevator. I wanted the reality of their situation to creep up on them slowly. I went back to my apartment, poured a glass of wine, and went to sleep. 48 hours later, the silence was violently broken. My phone began vibrating across my kitchen counter, a relentless buzzing that sounded like a swarm of angry bees. I picked it up to find an absolute avalanche of text messages. They were from extended family members, aunts, uncles, and cousins who only ever reached out when there was gossip to consume. You should be ashamed of yourself, one message read. After everything your parents did for you, another said. Money really exposes the true sociopaths in a family, read a third. I frowned and opened my browser. A quick search revealed exactly what had triggered the mob. Jamal and Sydney had orchestrated a masterpiece of digital manipulation. They had uploaded a video to TikTok and the algorithm had caught it instantly. It was already sitting at 500,000 views. There was Sydney sitting gracefully on the grand mahogany staircase of the Crestwood estate. She was wearing an oversized cashmere sweater, expertly looking fragile and exhausted. She dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue, while Jamal stood behind her, a protective hand resting on her shoulder, playing the role of the stoic defender. It breaks my heart to share this, Sydney said to the camera, her voice trembling flawlessly. But my sister tried to exploit our parents. She tried to manipulate the family trust to steal our family home and throw us out. My parents had to make the agonizing decision to cut her off to protect our legacy. It is so incredibly hard when the toxicity comes from your own blood. Jamal chimed in, staring solemnly into the lens. We are focusing on healing and protecting our peace. Sometimes you have to cut off the dead branches so the tree can grow. I watched the video twice. The sheer audacity of their gaslighting was breathtaking. The comment section was flooded with strangers validating them, praising Sydney for her bravery, and calling me a monster. A younger version of me would have panicked. I would have drafted a frantic emotional response, posting screenshots of bank statements to clear my name. I would have begged my relatives to believe the truth. But at 34, I knew that arguing with a narcissist smear campaign was like fighting the ocean. You only drown yourself. I did not type a single word in my defense. I simply set my phone down and opened my laptop. As I logged into the master control server for Crestwood, my phone rang. The caller ID flashed Thomas. My father. I answered it, putting it on speakerphone while my fingers hovered over the keyboard. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was doing. His voice was frantic and laced with irritation. Nora, what did you do to the thermostat? The entire house is freezing. And I just got a furious call from the landscaping company. They said their monthly retainer bounced and they are threatening to place a mechanic's lien on the property. I need the administrative passwords to the software right now. Stop throwing a tantrum and fix this. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the panic beneath his anger. I am not throwing a tantrum, Dad, I said, my voice perfectly level. I am complying with the legal document you forced me to sign 2 days ago. I am no longer a beneficiary of the trust. I have zero legal standing to manage the property, authorize vendor payments, or control the utilities. Doing so would be trespassing on Jamal and Sydney's asset. Do not play games with me, he barked, his voice echoing slightly, telling me he was standing in the cavernous, unheated foyer of the mansion. Jamal does not know how to run this system. He says the interface is locked. Just give me the passwords and we can forget this happened. Jamal is an angel investor, I replied coldly. I am sure he can figure out how to pay a heating bill. You wanted me out. You got it. Nora, I am warning you, if you do not hand over those credentials, goodbye, Dad. I hung up. I looked at the server dashboard. It monitored the smart thermostats, the automated gates, the vendor payment schedules, and the cloud storage holding 6 years of maintenance blueprints. With one keystroke, I executed the command. A red progress bar flashed across the screen. Delete all data. Confirm. I watched the modules go dark one by one. The payment schedules were erased. The vendor contacts were wiped. The climate control system reset to factory default, which meant it required manual reprogramming by a certified technician. The Crestwood estate was now completely disconnected, a massive, expensive brick waiting for its new owners to actually take responsibility. I permanently blocked my parents, Sydney and Jamal. I blocked every aunt and cousin who had sent me a hateful message. I severed the infected limb entirely. Over the next 6 months, I channeled every ounce of my rage into Vanguard acquisitions. My company was built on identifying distressed commercial and residential real estate properties drowning in bad debt or mismanaged by heirs who had no idea what they were doing. We would buy them out, restructure the debt, and flip the properties into high-yield assets. I worked 80-hour weeks. I flew across the country pitching to venture capitalists and private equity firms. I used the pain of my family's betrayal as rocket fuel. It paid off. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Vanguard closed a massive Series A funding round, securing $30 million in capital to expand our acquisition portfolio. I was sitting in my sleek, high-rise office in Manhattan, reviewing the final term sheets with my lead counsel. I had built my own empire, one entirely free from my mother's judgment and my father's cowardice. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and walked over to my terminal. Out of habit, I still kept the Crestwood Estate's property address loaded into my proprietary MarketWatch software. The program was designed to monitor public county records, flagging any new financial activity on targeted properties. As I took a sip of my coffee, a bright red alert banner dropped down across my monitor. I clicked the notification, bringing up a fresh filing from the county clerk's office. I read the document once, and then I read it again, my eyes widening in disbelief. It was a deed of trust securing a new home equity line of credit, commonly known as a HELOC. Jamal and Sydney had just taken out a secret loan against the estate. And it was not a small line of credit to fix the roof or pay the heating bill. They had leveraged the house for a staggering $2.5 million. The timeline of the destruction was accelerating far faster than I had anticipated. The trap was setting itself, and they had just walked right in. 6 months passed. I was relentless. Vanguard Acquisitions was swallowing up distressed commercial lots and crumbling strip malls across the entire East Coast. My team was growing, my profit margins were widening, and I was making more money in a single quarter than my father had made in his best decade. I was building a fortress of actual tangible wealth. But no matter how busy my schedule became, I always carved out 10 minutes every Friday morning to check the county public records for Crestwood Estate. The $2.5 million loan was just the beginning of their financial bleeding. Public records and social media told a glaring story of absolute recklessness. Jamal had launched his new cryptocurrency token, constantly hyping it up on Instagram and Twitter as the next big decentralized finance revolution. He had poured the loan money into flashy marketing campaigns, renting luxury yachts in Miami for promotional videos, and paying D-list influencers to endorse a completely hollow digital asset. He was playing the role of a visionary tech founder, but the foundational code of his token was copied and pasted from open-source forums. Meanwhile, Sydney was doing exactly what she had been trained to do her entire life. She was spending money she did not earn. She bought a brand new Porsche Cayenne in cash just to post a picture of the steering wheel. She upgraded their country club membership to the elite platinum tier, hosting lavish champagne brunches for her friends who secretly despised her. They were living like billionaires on borrowed time, completely ignoring the massive variable interest payments ticking away on that home equity loan. They were burning the house down from the inside to keep themselves warm. The inevitable cracks started showing by early November. I was in the middle of a high-stakes meeting with my board of directors in the glass-walled conference room of my firm. We were discussing a lucrative $10 million commercial acquisition. I was just pulling up the zoning maps on the projector when I heard a commotion near the reception desk. The heavy glass doors of the conference room suddenly swung open. My mother, Brenda, stood in the doorway. She was wearing her signature Chanel jacket, but her hair was slightly out of place, and her eyes darted nervously around the sleek minimalist office. She had somehow bypassed the lobby security, likely by berating my 22-year-old receptionist until the poor girl buzzed her through out of sheer panic. The room went completely silent. My board members, a group of serious, sharp-suited investors, looked at her and then looked at me. "Nora, darling, we need to talk right now," my mother announced, her voice echoing in the quiet space. She attempted to put on her usual mask of aristocratic authority, but her hands were trembling as she clutched her designer handbag. I did not flinch. I did not stand up. I looked at my lead counsel, gave him a subtle nod to pause the presentation, and turned my chair to face her. "You are interrupting a board meeting, Brenda," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You need to wait in the lobby." "I will not be dismissed like one of your employees," she snapped, stepping further into the room. "It cannot wait. Your father is having chest pains from the stress." Jamal got tied up in his brilliant investments and simply forgot about the county property taxes. The grace period is over today. If we do not pay $50,000 by 5 o'clock, the county is going to file a tax lien on the estate. It will ruin our credit. I need you to write us a check right now. We can consider it a loan. I stared at her, genuinely amazed by the sheer scale of her delusion. She had walked into my company, interrupted my business, and demanded $50,000 as if she were asking to borrow a cup of sugar. "A loan," I repeated, leaning back in my chair. "You drove all the way into the city to ask the daughter you legally disinherited for a loan to save the house you kicked her out of." She waved her hand dismissively, falling right back into her abusive gaslighting tactics. "Oh, please stop being so dramatic, Nora. That piece of paper Mr. Higgins drew up was just a formality to protect the asset. Family helps family. You clearly have plenty of money now. Look at this office. You owe us for raising you. Now write the check and stop trying to punish us for Sydney's success." I felt the eyes of my entire board of directors on me. This was the moment that defined who I was going to be for the rest of my life. I stood up slowly, picked up my desk phone, and pressed the button for the security desk. "Marcus," I said into the speaker, "please send 2 guards up to the conference room on the top floor. We have an unauthorized trespasser who needs to be escorted out of the building immediately." My mother dropped her jaw. Her face flushed a deep, ugly shade of crimson. "You would not dare throw your own mother out with security guards," she hissed, her voice shaking with rage. "You told me I was a financial liability, Brenda," I said loudly, making sure every single person in the room heard me clearly. "I am just protecting my company from bad investments. Your husband let Jamal leverage a $5 million house for a crypto scam. Your golden child is driving a Porsche she cannot afford. You are completely broke and you are trying to use me as your emergency fund. My answer is no. Now leave before I have you arrested for trespassing." The two security guards appeared in the doorway, large men in dark suits who politely but firmly stepped toward her. Brenda realized she had absolutely no power here. The social humiliation of being dragged out of a corporate office was too much for her fragile ego. She took a step back, her eyes burning with pure hatred. "You are a bitter, jealous little girl," she spat, her voice echoing down the hallway as the guards guided her backward. "You think you are so smart with your little real estate company? Jamal's startup is going public next month. His investors are lining up. We are about to be richer than you could ever dream, Nora. You will come crawling back to us begging for a handout, and I will slam the door in your face." She turned on her heel and practically ran to the elevator, the security guards trailing closely behind her. The doors slid shut, cutting off her furious tirade. I took a deep breath, smoothing my blazer, and turned back to my board of directors. "I apologize for the interruption, gentlemen," I said smoothly. "Let us return to the zoning maps for the new commercial park." The meeting continued without another hitch, but as soon as the boardroom cleared an hour later, I walked over to my desk and pulled up my Bloomberg terminal. I did not care about the county tax lien. A $50,000 lien was a minor scratch. I was looking for the fatal blow. I typed in the ticker symbol for Jamal's heavily promoted cryptocurrency token. The chart loaded instantly on the screen. I stood there in the quiet of my office, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. The line on the graph was not going up. It was practically a straight vertical drop. A major cryptocurrency exchange had just delisted Jamal's token, citing severe liquidity issues and suspected fraud. The market capitalization was evaporating by the second. The crypto market was crashing, taking Jamal's imaginary wealth down with it. The bank was going to call the $2.5 million loan, and my family did not have a single dime to pay it back. It was late Friday evening, 2 weeks after my mother's humiliating exit from my office. Vanguard Acquisitions had just officially closed our $30 million Series A funding round. To celebrate this massive milestone, I hosted my board of directors and executive team at an impossibly exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant in Manhattan. We were seated in a semi-private alcove surrounded by rich mahogany paneling and the quiet, respectful hum of actual generational wealth. I was raising my crystal glass of vintage Cabernet, preparing to make a toast to our aggressive new expansion strategy, when a painfully familiar and excessively loud voice sliced right through the elegant atmosphere. "Keep the oysters coming, only the absolute best for my top-tier investors." I lowered my glass slowly. A few tables away, seated directly in my line of sight in the center of the main dining room, were Jamal and Sydney. They were hosting a table of 4 younger men in flashy, poorly tailored suits. These were likely the last remaining crypto bros who had not yet realized Jamal's token was practically worthless. Jamal was wearing a dark velvet dinner jacket, gesturing wildly with his hands to ensure everyone around him noticed the heavy gold Rolex on his wrist. As he ordered, his eyes scanned the room and locked onto me. I saw the immediate aggressive shift in his posture. His ego, secretly bruised by the sinking crypto market, desperately demanded an audience. Jamal actually stood up slightly, raising his voice intentionally, so it carried over the gentle piano music straight to my table. "See that woman over there?" Jamal announced to his guests, pointing a finger directly at me while addressing his table. "That is my sister-in-law. She buys up cheap, broken-down strip malls. Cute little side hustle for a woman, right? But tonight, gentlemen, we are celebrating the future of decentralized finance. We are the new Wall Street." My board members, a group of serious, sharp-suited investors managing billions of dollars, exchanged confused, irritated glances. My lead counsel started to stand up to intervene, but I held up a hand signaling him to sit down and ignore the clown. But Jamal was not finished performing. He snapped his fingers loudly at the sommelier, an incredibly rude gesture in a place like this. "Bring us 3 bottles of the Louis Roederer Cristal, the 2008 vintage, and make sure my sister-in-law's table sees how the real money celebrates. $3,000 a bottle. $9,000 in champagne alone ordered simply to impress strangers and spite me. Sydney looked utterly radiant, tossing her perfectly styled blonde hair and smiling smugly in my direction. She was entirely unaware that the financial ground beneath her designer heels had already crumbled into dust. She genuinely believed Jamal was the king of the financial world. For the next 2 hours, they performed a masterclass in obnoxious nouveau riche behavior. They laughed entirely too loudly, sent premium Wagyu steaks back to the kitchen with arrogant complaints, and made a point to toast to their massive impending wealth every 15 minutes. My colleagues eventually brushed the spectacle off, deeply engaged in our own multi-million-dollar acquisition strategies. I ate my perfectly seared scallops in complete peace, sipping my wine and watching the train wreck unfold in slow motion. I knew something they did not. I knew the exact market capitalization of Jamal's token at that very second. I knew it was trading at a fraction of a single penny. I knew the exchange had frozen their liquidity pool. The climax of their theatrical performance arrived right alongside the dessert course. The waiter approached Jamal's table with a discreet black leather folder containing the bill. Jamal did not even bother to look at the total. He pulled a sleek heavy metal credit card from his designer wallet and dropped it onto the silver tray with a loud, arrogant clack. He went right back to bragging about his imaginary yacht in Miami. The waiter nodded politely and walked away. 5 minutes later, the restaurant manager approached Jamal's table. He was a tall man with a fiercely professional demeanor and zero tolerance for nonsense. He leaned down and whispered something discreetly into Jamal's ear. Jamal's confident wide grin vanished instantly. He snatched the first metal card back from the manager's tray and aggressively handed over a second one, muttering something about a bank security fraud alert. 2 minutes later, the manager returned. He was no longer whispering. "Sir, I must insist," the manager's voice carried cleanly across the suddenly quiet dining room. "Both of your primary cards have been declined by the issuer. We also attempted to run the secondary Visa card you provided, and it returned a hard decline for insufficient funds. Do you have another form of payment for the $8,400 balance?" The color completely drained from Sydney's face, leaving her looking physically sick. The crypto bros sitting with them suddenly looked down at their phones in unison, avoiding all eye contact, suddenly realizing their fearless leader was completely broke. Jamal furiously tapped on his banking app on his phone, his hands visibly shaking as the screen undoubtedly showed him a string of frozen accounts and zero balances. He started raising his voice at the manager, claiming the machine was broken. Sydney's panicked, terrified eyes darted around the room and locked onto me. The sheer crushing embarrassment broke her completely. She stood up, nearly knocking over her heavy dining chair, and rushed across the room to my table. She leaned down, gripping the edge of my table. "Nora," she whispered frantically, her voice trembling with absolute desperation. "Nora, please. There is a glitch with Jamal's bank. They locked his accounts by mistake. Can you just cover this tab? Please, we are family. Do not let them embarrass us in front of all these people. I will pay you back tomorrow, I swear." I looked up at her, my face a mask of absolute chilling indifference. I did not say a single word to her. I simply pulled out my own corporate card and handed it to my waiter to settle my table's bill. When the receipt came, I added a generous $2,000 tip for the impeccable service. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored suit. My board members stood up with me, completely ignoring the desperate woman hovering by our table. I leaned in close to Sydney's ear so only she could hear me. "Better call Mom and Dad for a bailout," I whispered. I walked right past her, leading my executives out of the restaurant and leaving Sydney and Jamal trapped with an $8,000 bill they could not pay, surrounded by angry management and their own evaporating lies. I slept perfectly that night. The absolute destruction of their facade had begun. The next morning, I was sitting in my kitchen with a cup of black coffee when Vanguard's monitoring software chimed loudly from my laptop. I opened the dashboard. The Crestwood estate had officially missed 3 consecutive mortgage payments on the massive home equity loan Jamal had taken out. The countdown to total foreclosure had officially started. 2 days later, the reality of their financial rot was stapled directly to the front door of the Crestwood estate. It was a bright, obnoxious yellow piece of paper completely ruining the aesthetic of the Grand Oak entryway. A formal notice of default. The bank was officially moving to seize the $5 million property. They did not just mail it quietly. They sent a process server who marched right past the broken security gates and taped it right at eye level. It was a glaring neon billboard of their failure, ensuring that every nosy neighbor from the homeowners association saw it clearly when they walked their purebred dogs past the driveway that morning. The appearance of that yellow notice ignited an absolute explosion of infighting within the walls of the mansion. The fragile alliance that had bound my family together in their shared hatred of me completely shattered under the weight of financial ruin. Thomas had finally woken up from his country club-induced coma. The bank's legal threats forced him to march into Jamal's home office and demand to see the actual unfiltered financial ledgers for the revolutionary cryptocurrency token. What Thomas found was a barren digital wasteland. The $2.5 million home equity loan was completely gone. Jamal had funneled the cash into offshore marketing accounts, paid himself a massive executive consulting fee, which he immediately blew on luxury goods, and watched the token's market value evaporate to zero in a textbook rug pull scam. The fallout was nuclear. Through the grapevine of the elite social circles, word traveled fast, and my industry contacts were more than happy to feed me the details of their desperate scramble. Thomas and Jamal engaged in screaming matches that could be heard from the street. Thomas roared that Jamal was a fraud, a con artist who had bankrupted the family legacy. Jamal, his massive ego refusing to accept any accountability, shouted back that it was simply market volatility and that Thomas was an old man who did not understand decentralized finance. Jamal insisted he just needed another bridge loan to launch a second version of the token. Sydney, meanwhile, was paralyzed by hysteria, weeping in her bedroom as she realized her platinum credit cards were about to be declined at her favorite designer boutiques. Panic set in, but it was a panic heavily filtered through their obsession with social status. Brenda demanded they sell the house immediately to pay off the bank before the sheriff arrived to physically evict them. But Thomas immediately and violently shut that down. The idea of listing the Crestwood estate on the multiple listing service was a fate worse than death for him. If they put a public for sale sign on the front lawn, the entire golf club would know they were destitute. Their elite circle of friends would see the fire sale price and smell the blood in the water. Thomas knew that if the foreclosure became public knowledge, his reputation would be dead, and he would be laughed out of every boardroom in the city. The social humiliation was simply unacceptable. They would rather lose everything in secret than admit they were wrong in public. So they devised a cowardly strategy. Jamal, desperately trying to regain control of the narrative and save his position as the supposed financial savior of the family, promised he could fix the mess. He claimed he still had elite connections in the private equity world. The strategy was to find an off-market private cash buyer. They needed an investment firm willing to purchase the mega mansion quietly, behind closed doors, with absolutely no public listings, no open houses, and no gossip. They were looking for a buyer who would pay off the $2.5 million bank loan and toss them a few $100,000 in equity. This would allow them to quietly move to a luxury condo in Miami and spin a false narrative to their friends that they were simply downsizing for a lifestyle upgrade. Jamal spent the next 48 hours aggressively submitting the property details to private investment portals, luxury wholesale real estate forums, and distressed asset networks. He was practically begging the dark corners of the internet for a discreet savior, someone who would take the crumbling estate off their hands without asking too many questions. He thought he was being incredibly stealthy. He thought he was outsmarting the traditional real estate market. He did not realize that the digital real estate world is remarkably small and it answers to the highest bidder. Sitting in my high-rise corner office at Vanguard Acquisitions, I watched Jamal's desperate inquiries light up my digital lead generation software. My data scraping algorithms, specifically designed to hunt for off-market distressed properties, flagged the Crestwood estate address the exact second he submitted it to a private broker network. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, sipping my espresso, watching the digital breadcrumbs of their sheer panic populate on my massive monitor. They wanted a ghost. They wanted a faceless corporation to bail them out quietly and save their precious social standing. I smiled a cold, calculated smile and reached for my desk phone. I pressed the speed dial for my lead corporate attorney. "David," I said, my voice perfectly steady and void of any emotion. "I need you to draft an aggressive letter of intent for a residential purchase. Cash offer, 14-day close, entirely off market. But do not put it under Vanguard Acquisitions. I want this routed through our secondary shell company. Write the offer up under Apex Holdings, LLC." David did not waste a single minute. Within 2 hours, a highly classified, heavily legally protected letter of intent was sitting in Jamal's inbox. I sat at my desk and watched the read receipt pop up on my tracking software. I could perfectly imagine the scene unfolding in the mahogany study of Crestwood Estate. Jamal sweating in his designer chair, opening an email from an entity called Apex Holdings. The subject line was simple: confidential cash offer for Crestwood Estate. The terms David drafted were brutally precise and intentionally offensive. We offered $2.8 million. For a sprawling estate appraised at over $5 million, it was a massive lowball. But the bait was irresistible. The offer included a 14-day closing period, an all-cash transfer, and an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, ensuring the sale would never be published on any public real estate platform. We were offering them the exact ghost they were praying for, dressed in a very cheap suit. My phone buzzed with an update from my private investigator, who had a contact inside the family's country club. The reaction inside the house was exactly as volatile as I had predicted. When Jamal brought the printed offer to Thomas, my father reportedly went completely ballistic. Thomas looked at the $2.8 million figure and felt his fragile pride shatter all over again. The math was humiliating. After paying off the $2.5 million home equity loan, the family would be left with a measly $300,000 to split. It was a staggering loss of generational wealth. Thomas demanded they reject it. He shouted that they were being robbed by corporate vultures. But Jamal, driven by sheer desperation and a bloated, unearned ego, stepped in to manipulate the narrative. He cornered Thomas, weaponizing my father's deepest fear. Jamal reminded him that the bank's foreclosure deadline was rapidly approaching. He asked Thomas if he preferred to see his precious Crestwood estate auctioned off on the courthouse steps for everyone in their elite social circle to witness. That shut Thomas down immediately. The fear of public poverty was much stronger than his financial logic. Then Jamal did what narcissists always do. He convinced himself he was the smartest man in the room. He told Thomas that this initial offer was just a starting point. He boasted that Apex Holdings was probably just some faceless automated corporate algorithm and that he could easily outmaneuver them at the negotiating table. He promised my father he would squeeze this corporation for every last drop of equity and force them to cover all the closing costs. The next morning, David arranged a formal video conference to discuss the terms of the sale. I was sitting in my office, a hot cup of coffee in my hand, as the meeting connected on my secondary monitor. David sat in his own pristine office, looking every bit the ruthless corporate shark in his tailored suit. I logged into the call using a masked IP address. My display name was simply set to legal assistant, and both my camera and microphone were permanently disabled. The video feed from the estate popped up on the screen. Jamal was sitting at the head of my father's heavy wooden desk, wearing a sharp blazer, trying desperately to project an aura of immense wealth and control. Thomas sat slightly behind him, looking pale and exhausted, chewing nervously on the inside of his cheek. "Let us skip the pleasantries," Jamal started, leaning into the camera with an arrogant smirk. "We received your incredibly low offer. Frankly, it is insulting. We have several private equity groups looking at this property right now. But I am a busy man with a major tech launch approaching, and I appreciate your firm's discretion. If you want this asset, you are going to have to play ball on my terms." David, fully briefed on my strategy, kept his face completely impassive. We are prepared to negotiate, Jamal. What are your terms? Jamal leaned back, lacing his fingers together behind his head. I want the 2.8 million in cash wired directly to the title company within 10 days, not 14. And Apex Holdings will assume absolutely all closing costs. The title insurance, the transfer taxes, the escrow fees, everything. Furthermore, there are a few minor vendor liens on the property from some landscaping disputes. Apex assumes those too. You buy it entirely as is, and we walk away completely clean. I muted my speakers so they would not hear me laughing. Jamal thought he was backing a massive corporation into a corner. He had no idea he was aggressively demanding the exact terms I needed him to take. David pretended to hesitate. He looked down at his notes, frowned, and tapped his pen against his desk. Assuming all closing costs and existing vendor liens is highly unusual for a discounted cash purchase, Jamal. My board will need some concessions if we are taking on that level of immediate liability. I am not asking, David. Jamal interrupted loudly, trying to sound like a Wall Street titan. Those are the terms. Take it or I walk. David let a heavy 10-second silence hang in the air. Then he sighed, playing the part of a defeated negotiator perfectly. Very well. If Apex Holdings is going to absorb all back-end closing costs and waive the standard inspection contingencies, we will require a specific indemnity addendum to protect our corporate tax liabilities. Jamal frowned slightly. What kind of addendum? It is entirely standard boilerplate for distressed asset transfers, David replied smoothly. It simply states that Apex Holdings is completely indemnified against any federal tax obligations arising from the clearance of your existing debt. Specifically, an acknowledgement regarding IRS Form 1099-C. It just means that when we pay off your bank loan to clear the title, your family retains the tax responsibility for the debt forgiveness. It protects our shareholders. Thomas, finally speaking up, leaned forward. Maybe we should have Mr. Higgins look over this addendum before we agree to anything. Jamal immediately shot Thomas a venomous look. Mr. Higgins charges $600 an hour, Thomas. Do you have that kind of cash lying around right now? I do not think so. Jamal turned back to the camera, his ego completely blinding him to the fatal trap David had just laid. I have dealt with these corporate liability waivers 100 times in the crypto space. It is just legal red tape. We agree to the addendum, draft the final contract, and send it over. We will sign it today. David nodded slowly, a microscopic smirk playing on the corner of his mouth. Excellent. I will have the final document sent via secure portal within the hour. Pleasure doing business with you, gentlemen. The video feed disconnected. I sat back in my chair and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my coffee. Jamal's sheer arrogance and his desperate need to avoid paying a real lawyer had just sealed their fate. They were so blinded by the promise of walking away with $300,000 in cash that they eagerly agreed to a tax code they did not understand. They had just willingly signed their own financial death warrant, and they were probably celebrating in that mansion right now. The celebration inside the Crestwood estate was undoubtedly deafening. I did not have to guess because 3 days after Jamal signed the preliminary contract with Apex Holdings, a thick cream-colored envelope arrived at my apartment. It was a formal invitation embossed in heavy gold foil. Sydney was throwing a massive farewell gala. They were spinning a magnificent lie. The invitation boldly claimed that Jamal's business ventures had become so wildly successful that they were permanently relocating to a luxury penthouse in Miami. They were deliberately framing the desperate and secret sale of our childhood home as a strategic lifestyle upgrade. My mother had personally written a handwritten note on the back of my invitation. It read, "We thought you might want to see the house one last time before we move on to bigger and better things. Try to dress appropriately." It was a blatant and pathetic attempt to rub their imaginary victory in my face. They genuinely believed they had outsmarted a multi-million-dollar corporation. They thought they were walking away completely clean, escaping a $2.5 million debt, and pocketing a $300,000 cash surplus. They were so confident in their deception that they were throwing a $50,000 party with money they did not even possess yet. I arrived at the estate on Saturday evening wearing a tailored emerald green silk dress that cost more than my mother's entire current wardrobe. The grand circular driveway was lined with rented luxury vehicles and private valet attendants. They had hired a professional string quartet to play on the back terrace, and waiters in crisp white uniforms, carrying silver trays of imported champagne, navigated through a crowded room of local socialites. It was an absolute masterclass in financial smoke and mirrors. But as I walked through the heavy mahogany double doors, I looked past the rented floral arrangements and saw the undeniable truth. The house was dying. Without my personal income funding the endless maintenance, the Crestwood estate was decaying rapidly. I noticed the deep, ugly scuff marks on the original hardwood floors where Jamal had carelessly dragged heavy furniture. I looked up at the ceiling in the grand foyer and spotted a massive yellow water stain spreading outward near the crystal chandelier, a clear sign that the roof leak I had warned them about months ago had been completely ignored. The expensive silk wallpaper in the main hallway was beginning to peel at the corners due to the lack of proper climate control. They were hosting a lavish high society event inside a house that was structurally suffocating. I walked through the crowded living room, completely ignoring the confused and judgmental stares from my parents' country club friends, who had undoubtedly watched Sydney's crying video on social media. I grabbed a glass of red wine from a passing waiter and positioned myself near the massive stone fireplace. Before Sydney approached me, I watched my father. Thomas was standing with a group of local bank executives he regularly golfed with. He was holding an unlit imported cigar, laughing loudly and clapping them on the back. He was desperately selling the narrative that this abrupt sale was simply a strategic portfolio liquidation to free up capital for Jamal's next big venture. He briefly caught my eye across the crowded room, and his confident smile vanished instantly. He quickly turned his back to me, the cowardice radiating from his rigid posture. He was publicly celebrating a corporate bailout because he was simply too weak to admit to his friends that his son-in-law was a total fraud. Then Sydney spotted me. She cut right through the crowd, her eyes locked onto me, like a predator spotting prey. She was wearing a shimmering gold designer gown with thick diamond tennis bracelets dripping from both of her wrists. She looked like a wealthy socialite, but up close I could see the frantic manic energy vibrating behind her eyes. She was mentally exhausted from maintaining the massive lie. "Well, look who actually decided to show up," Sydney said, her voice dripping with heavy condescension as she stopped right in front of me. "I am honestly surprised you had the nerve to walk in here after everything you tried to do to our family. But I suppose you just wanted to see what real success looks like before we leave you behind in this boring state." I took a very slow sip of my wine, letting my eyes travel up and down her rented designer dress. "The party is beautiful, Sydney. Miami is a very big move. I am sure Jamal's crypto business is doing phenomenal down there." "It absolutely is." Sydney beamed, taking the bait instantly and raising her chin. "The market is transitioning, but Jamal is 10 steps ahead of everyone else. In fact, he is the one who engineered this entire real estate sale. Some massive corporate conglomerate called Apex Holdings tried to lowball us last week, but Jamal backed them right into a corner. He forced them to take the house exactly as it is and cover every single closing cost. We are practically robbing them blind. We closed the deal on Tuesday morning, and then we are off to South Beach." I smiled. It was a genuine warm smile that clearly unsettled her. "That is incredibly impressive," I said softly, stepping just a fraction closer to her so I did not have to raise my voice over the string quartet. "Jamal must be an absolute legal genius to pull one over on a firm like that." "I deal with corporate acquisitions all the time in my line of work, Sydney. Apex Holdings has a very specific reputation in the industry. They are notoriously ruthless with their contracts. They never take on liabilities without a massive back-end penalty for the seller." Sydney's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. Her knuckles turned white as her grip on her champagne flute tightened. "Jamal handled everything perfectly," she said, her voice suddenly slightly defensive and sharp. "We read the contract. It is completely bulletproof. I nodded slowly, maintaining unbroken, piercing eye contact. I am sure he did. But corporate lawyers always hide things in the boilerplate text: tax indemnities, federal debt forgiveness clauses. The kind of things that look like standard legal red tape until the Internal Revenue Service freezes your bank accounts for $1 million in unpaid income taxes. I just really hope you actually hired a real attorney to read the fine print, Sydney. For your own sake. I did not wait for her to formulate a response. I gave her a polite, dismissive nod, turned my back on her, and walked toward the open doors of the terrace. I left her standing right in the middle of her fake victory party, staring blankly at the back of my head. She laughed it off a moment later, turning back to her friends, with a forced and overly loud giggle. But the damage was already done. I had planted the seed of doubt deep in her mind, and I knew she would spend the next 3 days agonizing over a legal contract she was far too ignorant to understand. 48 hours before the scheduled Tuesday morning closing, the hangover from Sydney's lavish farewell party was violently interrupted. It was Monday morning, and the clock was ticking down to the final wire transfer. But before Apex Holdings released a single dime, the contract dictated a mandatory final walkthrough by our corporate assessment team. I was sitting at my desk at Vanguard Acquisitions, staring at my secondary monitor. I clicked a secure link, and a high-definition live video feed filled the screen. My head of acquisitions, a brilliant and ruthlessly thorough man named Carter, was standing on the front porch of the Crestwood estate. He was dressed down in heavy work boots, a high-visibility utility vest, and a hard hat. Pinned discreetly to the center of his vest was a wide-angle body camera, broadcasting a live feed directly to my office. We were documenting the exact condition of the property for liability purposes, but it was also providing me with a front-row seat to the final act of their pathetic play. The massive wooden door swung open, and Jamal appeared on my screen. He was wearing silk pajamas and a plush designer robe, holding a cup of espresso. He looked Carter up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You must be the laborers Apex sent over," Jamal sneered, not bothering to step aside. "Listen closely, buddy. We just hosted a massive gala here, and my wife is sleeping. Keep your boots clean, do not touch the art, and make it quick. I have a call with my wealth management team in 20 minutes. Carter, a seasoned professional who handled multi-million-dollar commercial negotiations daily, played his part perfectly. He simply nodded, his face blank. "Standard final walkthrough, sir. Just need to verify the structural integrity matches the initial disclosures." Jamal scoffed, stepping back to let Carter and his two associates into the grand foyer. He immediately began treating them like absolute garbage. As Carter documented the peeling wallpaper and the water stains I had seen the night before, Jamal trailed behind him, loudly talking on his cell phone to one of his fake crypto investors. He was intentionally projecting his voice so the blue-collar workers would hear how important he was. "Yeah, I am just babysitting the inspectors from Apex Holdings," Jamal bragged into his phone, leaning against a marble pillar while Carter took photos of the damaged drywall. "These corporate guys are absolute idiots. I am taking them for an absolute ride. They are covering all the closing costs and taking this entire property as is. Easiest $3 million I ever made. I practically sold them a sinking ship." I sat in my office and smiled coldly at the screen. He was proudly confessing to real estate fraud on a recorded corporate feed. His arrogance was truly a bottomless pit. Carter moved methodically through the first floor, ignoring Jamal's classist remarks and arrogant posturing. The team checked the HVAC systems, the plumbing fixtures, and the window seals. Jamal grew increasingly impatient, loudly complaining that they were wasting his time and that the contract was already locked in. But then Carter turned his attention to the rear of the house, heading toward the sunken conservatory that led out to the back gardens. "Wait, where are you going?" Jamal snapped abruptly, hanging up his phone and stepping in front of Carter. "There is nothing to see in there. It is just a sunroom. Standard protocol dictates we check all load-bearing transition zones," Carter replied calmly, stepping past Jamal and pushing open the glass doors. The conservatory was supposed to be the crown jewel of the house, a sprawling room with floor-to-ceiling windows. But the moment Carter walked in, I saw what they were trying to hide. Right in the center of the room, Covering almost the entire span of the stone floor was a massive, heavy Persian rug. It was entirely out of place, positioned awkwardly to cover a specific section of the tiles. Carter walked straight toward the rug. Jamal panicked. He rushed forward, physically placing himself between Carter and the center of the room. "I said we are done here," Jamal barked, his fake wealthy persona cracking to reveal the desperate fraud underneath. "You have seen enough. Get out of my house before I call your corporate office and have you fired for harassing the seller. Sir, if you restrict access to any part of the property, the walkthrough is legally classified as failed," Carter stated firmly. "Apex Holdings will immediately withdraw the cash offer and the escrow funds will be recalled. Do I have your permission to lift this rug, or am I calling my legal department to cancel the purchase?" Jamal froze. The threat of losing the cash bailout completely paralyzed him. He swallowed hard, stepping aside with a furious scowl. "Go ahead. It is just a stain on the tile." Carter bent down, grabbed the thick edge of the Persian rug, and pulled it back. Even through the body camera feed, the damage was breathtaking. It was not a stain. It was a massive, jagged foundation crack. The concrete subfloor had physically split, causing the expensive stone tiles to heave and shatter. The crack ran horizontally across the entire room, wide enough to drop a pen into. It was severe structural failure, the kind that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to excavate and repair. They had intentionally covered it up to scam the buyer. Carter stood up, pulling a digital tablet from his vest. He did not yell. He did not act shocked. He simply began reading the legal parameters of the contract they had signed. Section 4, Paragraph B. Carter read aloud, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. "The buyer retains the absolute right to terminate this agreement without penalty upon the discovery of any undisclosed structural hazards or foundation failure that materially affects the value of the property." Jamal's face drained of all color. The smug, arrogant crypto king was instantly replaced by a terrified little boy facing ruin. "Wait," Jamal stammered, holding up his hands. "Hold on. We can negotiate that. I can offer a seller credit. We can knock 20 grand off the price right now." "This is a structural liability failure, sir," Carter replied, typing onto his tablet. "I am officially flagging the property as hazardous. Apex Holdings is well within its rights to walk away from this deal immediately." Thomas, hearing the commotion, rushed into the conservatory wearing his golfing clothes. He looked at the massive crack in the floor, then at Carter, and finally at Jamal. The reality of the situation crashed down on them simultaneously. If Apex Holdings invoked the termination clause and walked away today, there was no backup plan. There was no time to find another buyer. The bank's absolute deadline was Friday. If this deal fell through, the sheriff would be at the door by the end of the week to throw them onto the street and auction the estate to the public. Total suffocating panic filled the room. Carter did not flinch at the sight of Thomas and Jamal unraveling. He simply tapped the screen of his tablet, his face completely devoid of sympathy. "I am uploading the hazard report to the legal department right now," Carter stated, his voice clinical and detached. "Given the severity of the structural compromise, I am required to recommend an immediate termination of the purchase agreement." Jamal lunged forward, grabbing the edge of Carter's utility vest. "You cannot do that. We had a deal. We signed a contract. You are supposed to take it as is." Carter easily brushed Jamal's hand away, taking a deliberate step back to ensure the wide-angle body camera captured the physical aggression. "As is applies to cosmetic defects and standard wear and tear, sir. It does not cover the deliberate concealment of catastrophic foundation failure. Apex Holdings is not in the business of buying sinkholes." Brenda came rushing into the conservatory, her heels clicking frantically against the shattered stone tiles. She had heard Jamal shouting and came to investigate, her face pale and drawn. When she saw the massive crater in the floor and the cold corporate inspector packing up his equipment, she completely lost her composure. The aristocratic facade she had maintained for decades instantly shattered into a million pieces. "Wait, please wait," Brenda pleaded, stepping in front of the glass doors to block Carter from leaving. "There must be a misunderstanding. We can fix it. Just give us time. We can hire contractors this afternoon." You do not have time, Carter replied flatly. At that exact moment, the tablet in Carter's hand chimed loudly. It was an incoming video call from the Apex Holdings legal department. It was David. I was sitting in my office miles away watching the entire exchange on my primary monitor, while typing rapid instructions to David on my secondary screen. I told David to turn the screws. I wanted them to feel the absolute terror of the edge before I offered them the rope. Carter answered the call and held the tablet up so my family could see David's stern, unforgiving face. I have reviewed the live feed and the preliminary hazard report, David announced, his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous broken room. Gentlemen, this is a blatant misrepresentation of a multi-million-dollar asset. Apex Holdings is officially withdrawing its letter of intent. The escrow funds will be recalled within the hour. Have a good day. No, David, please listen to me, Thomas shouted, shoving Jamal aside and practically pressing his face against the tablet screen. My father, a man who had spent his entire life projecting an image of untouchable wealth and superiority, was literally begging a corporate lawyer on a video call. You cannot pull out now. If you cancel this deal, the bank forecloses on Friday. We will lose everything. The public auction will destroy my family. I am begging you, we can renegotiate. Name your price. I watched my father grovel through the high-definition feed. It was a pathetic, visceral display of weakness. He did not care about the house anymore. He only cared about the public humiliation of the foreclosure. He was willing to sacrifice anything to keep his country club friends from finding out he was bankrupt. I typed a quick message to David. Offer the concession. Lock the tax trap. David paused on the screen, rubbing his chin as if he were deeply considering the desperate plea. He let them sweat in absolute silence for a grueling 30 seconds. I watched Thomas physically tremble as the seconds ticked by. Against my better judgment, Thomas. I will offer you one final alternative, David finally said. But the terms are absolutely non-negotiable. Apex Holdings will proceed with the purchase. We will pay the $2.8 million in cash, and we will clear the $2.5 million lien with your bank before Friday. However, because we are now absorbing a massive structural liability, we must strictly isolate our financial risk. Anything, Thomas said instantly, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of a patio chair. Just tell me what you need us to do. Carter will pull up a revised addendum on his tablet, David instructed. This document heavily reinforces the buyer's absolute immunity from any federal tax liabilities associated with the debt clearance. It explicitly states that under IRS regulations, specifically regarding the cancellation of debt, your family assumes 100% of the tax burden for the forgiven loan amount. Apex Holdings takes the house and the structural damage, and you take the cash surplus and the tax liability. You sign it right now without any further review, or the deal is dead. Thomas hesitated. He looked at the dense legal jargon filling the screen of Carter's tablet. He reached for his phone, his instincts finally screaming at him to call a professional. I need to send this to Mr. Higgins. Just give me 1 hour to have my tax attorney review the language. David shook his head on the screen. The offer expires in exactly 60 seconds, Thomas. If you call your lawyer, I am hanging up and the foreclosure proceeds. Jamal panicked. He saw his $300,000 cash surplus slipping away. He saw the absolute end of his fake crypto lifestyle. He grabbed Thomas by the shoulder, his grip vicious and demanding. Thomas signed the document. Jamal hissed, his voice tight with desperation. I am a financial founder, Thomas. I know how these corporate contracts work. They just want to cover their own audit trails. It is just standard corporate protection. We are getting $250,000 in cash and walking away from a foreclosure. Do you really want to lose that over some IRS boilerplate? Do you want your golf buddies to see your face on a bank foreclosure notice this weekend? Sign it right now. Brenda grabbed my father's other arm, tears streaming down her face, completely ruining her expensive makeup. Thomas, please, do not let them take the house publicly. We cannot survive that kind of embarrassment. Just sign it so we can leave and go to Miami. Thomas looked at his weeping wife, then at the arrogant son-in-law who had bankrupted them, and finally at the glowing digital signature line on the tablet. The pressure was insurmountable. He was trapped between the terrifying reality of federal tax codes he did not understand and the immediate crushing threat of social destruction. His hands trembling violently, Thomas reached out and pressed his index finger against the glass screen. He traced his signature awkwardly, authorizing the revised addendum. Carter immediately pulled the tablet back, verifying the digital ink. Addendum secured and uploaded to the legal server, Carter confirmed his tone entirely neutral. "Excellent," David said smoothly, his eyes flashing with a predatory gleam. "The contract is now legally binding and completely locked. We will see you all at the title company tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp for the final closing and wire transfer. Do not be late." The video call disconnected. Carter nodded once to Thomas, turned around, and walked out of the house without another word, leaving the front door wide open behind him. I sat in my office and let out a long, slow breath. The adrenaline was rushing through my veins, making my heart pound against my ribs. The trap was completely locked. They had just signed away their financial future, entirely blinded by their own ego and fear. I closed the video feed and stood up from my desk. I walked over to the closet in my private executive suite and opened the heavy wooden doors. I bypassed the standard business attire and reached for the very back of the rack. I pulled out a sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal gray designer suit. It was aggressive, powerful, and utterly unapologetic. Tomorrow morning I was not just buying a house. I was buying my ultimate vindication. The morning sun reflected harshly off the glass skyscrapers of Manhattan as Tuesday arrived. At exactly 8:45, my family walked into the opulent glass-walled conference room of Premier Title and Escrow. I was watching them from a private viewing room just down the hall, monitoring the closed-circuit security feed on my phone while David and my senior legal team prepared the final binders. They looked entirely ridiculous. They had dressed as if they were attending a royal coronation rather than a desperate fire sale to avoid total public humiliation. Thomas wore a bespoke navy suit that was slightly too tight, trying his hardest to project the image of an unbothered titan of industry. Brenda carried a massive crocodile skin handbag, her chin tilted up defensively, surveying the title office as if it were beneath her standards. Sydney was draped in a ridiculous amount of designer silk for a Tuesday morning, clinging tightly to Jamal's arm. Jamal, of course, was the loudest of them all. He strolled into the high-end title office as if he owned the entire building, flashing his gold Rolex and loudly demanding sparkling water from the young receptionist. The escrow agent, a quiet, meticulously organized man named Mr. Campbell, motioned for them to take their seats along one side of the massive marble conference table. On the opposite side sat 3 empty leather executive chairs reserved for the purchasing entity. "Can we expedite this process?" Jamal demanded, pulling out a heavy gold pen and tapping it impatiently against the marble table. "We have a private flight to Miami booked for this afternoon. The buyers already signed the structural addendum yesterday. Just give us the wire transfer confirmation so we can get out of here." Mr. Campbell adjusted his glasses, looking completely unbothered by Jamal's aggressive, arrogant posturing. "We are waiting for the authorized signatories for Apex Holdings, sir. The closing is scheduled for exactly 9 o'clock. We still have 10 minutes. Brenda sighed heavily, sinking into her expensive chair and crossing her arms. "Well, while we wait, you could at least get someone to bring me a decent espresso. The coffee in your lobby tastes like it was brewed in a gas station. We are finalizing a multi-million-dollar transaction here. I expect a basic level of hospitality." Mr. Campbell offered a tight, polite nod, but did not move an inch to fetch her coffee. I watched through the camera feed as Jamal leaned back, throwing his arm casually around Sydney's chair, playing the role of the conquering hero. "These corporate suits are all exactly the same," Jamal bragged loudly, making sure Mr. Campbell and everyone else in the room could hear him. "They drag their feet because they are mad I backed them into a corner. They thought they could bully us with that foundation hazard report, but I forced them to swallow this house whole. They are paying off the bank in full and cutting us $250,000 check. That is what happens when you actually know how to leverage an asset. You have to show these faceless corporations who is really in charge." Sydney giggled, leaning her head onto his shoulder. "You are brilliant, baby. I cannot wait to pick out the new condo in South Beach." I am so tired of the cold weather up here anyway. It is going to be amazing to start fresh with a massive pile of cash. Jamal laughed a booming, obnoxious sound. And the best part is that idiot lawyer yesterday practically begging us to sign that tax liability waiver. As if the IRS is going to care about a forgiven bank loan. They just want their little corporate audit trail covered. I swear these guys have no street smarts when it comes to high-level finance. Thomas sat silently at the far end of the table. He was the only one not celebrating. His eyes kept darting toward the heavy glass doors, his knee bouncing nervously under the mahogany table. He knew how close they had come to absolute ruin. He knew the bank's foreclosure deadline was practically breathing down their necks. He did not care about Miami or Jamal's supposed genius. He just wanted the money cleared so the nightmare would end and his country club reputation would remain intact. I stepped away from the monitor and looked at David. He held the thick leather binder containing the final closing documents, the deed transfer, and the wire authorizations. Beside him stood Bennett, my sharpest paralegal, carrying the supplemental financial breakdowns. "It is time," I said softly. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal gray suit. I had chosen this exact outfit because it was the armor of the world they desperately pretended to belong, to the world of actual untouchable capital. I walked down the heavily carpeted hallway, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. Every step was a testament to the years of rejection, the gaslighting, and the sheer cruelty I had endured. Today was the day the bill finally came due. Inside the conference room, the digital clock on the wall clicked to exactly 9 o'clock. Jamal scoffed and checked his watch. Unbelievable. 9 sharp and they are late. I should charge them a penalty fee for wasting my time. I have real investors to call. At that exact moment, I reached the heavy glass doors of the conference room. I did not knock. I did not pause to announce myself. I simply pushed both doors open simultaneously. They swung outward with a heavy, satisfying whoosh, hitting the rubber stoppers on the glass walls with a dull thud. The entire room went dead silent. The kind of silence that sucks the oxygen straight out of your lungs. I walked in my posture completely rigid, my face a mask of absolute unyielding ice. David flanked me on my right, carrying the binders, and Bennett flanked me on my left. I did not look at my parents. I did not look at my sister. I locked eyes entirely with Jamal. The smug, arrogant smirk on Jamal's face froze completely. It did not fade. It simply became paralyzed, as his brain utterly failed to process the reality of what he was seeing. Sydney's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in pure, unadulterated shock. Brenda actually dropped her crocodile skin handbag. The heavy thud of the leather hitting the carpet was the only sound in the room. Thomas gripped the edge of the marble table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. He stared at me as if he were looking at a ghost. He looked at David, instantly recognizing the ruthless corporate attorney from the video call yesterday. The horrific realization began to set in, washing over his pale face like a tidal wave of pure dread. The dots were connecting in his mind, and the picture they formed was apocalyptic. Nora Thomas stammered, his voice cracking and barely rising above a hoarse whisper. "What are you doing here?" I walked to the opposite side of the table. I did not rush. I pulled back the heavy leather executive chair positioned directly at the head of the table, exactly opposite of where they were sitting. I sat down smoothly, crossing my legs and folding my hands neatly on top of the cold marble surface. David and Bennett took the seats next to me, placing the Apex Holdings binders precisely in the center of the table. I looked at my father, then let my gaze sweep slowly over my mother, my sister, and finally rested it on the man who claimed he had outsmarted a faceless corporation. "I am the CEO and sole owner of Apex Holdings." I said, my voice perfectly calm and echoing clearly in the silent room. "I am here to buy my house." For a long, agonizing moment, nobody breathed. Then Jamal let out a sharp, breathless laugh. It was a hollow, desperate sound that bounced awkwardly off the glass walls. He looked over his shoulder, scanning the ceiling corners of the conference room as if he expected a hidden camera crew to jump out. "Okay, very funny," Jamal said, waving his hand dismissively, while his leg began to bounce uncontrollably. "Is this some kind of sick prank? You actually paid someone to set this up just to mess with us." "Look, Nora, We do not have time for your bitter little revenge fantasies. Where are the real Apex representatives? I did not blink. I reached out, resting my manicured fingers on the thick black binder sitting in front of me. I flipped the heavy cover open. I slid the entire binder smoothly across the marble table until it came to a stop directly in front of Jamal. Page 1. I instructed my tone absolute ice. State of New York Corporate Registry. Articles of Organization for Apex Holdings, LLC. Note the primary managerial signature at the bottom. Jamal leaned forward, his eyes darting frantically across the official state seal and the legally binding text. His gaze hit the bottom line. He saw my signature. He saw my name listed as the sole managing member and registered agent. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving an ashen, terrified expression in its wake. The reality hit him with the force of a freight train. There was no faceless conglomerate. There was only me. Sydney abruptly stood up, her chair screeching violently against the floor. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "This is illegal!" Sydney screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "This is absolute fraud. You lied to us. You impersonated a corporation to steal our house. We are calling the police right now. The deal is completely void." She reached frantically for her designer handbag to grab her phone, but David, my lead corporate attorney, cleared his throat. His voice was a weapon of absolute professional authority, slicing right through her hysterics. "I would strongly advise against wasting law enforcement resources, ma'am," David said calmly, not even bothering to look up from his notes. "There is absolutely no fraud here. Shell companies are a perfectly legal and standard vehicle for high-net-worth real estate acquisitions. My client had no legal obligation to disclose her personal identity to the seller. Furthermore, you were the ones who sought out off-market cash buyers. You entered into negotiations voluntarily." David adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Jamal. "You signed the initial letter of intent. You reviewed the terms. You actively negotiated the closing date. And yesterday you voluntarily authorized the structural hazard addendum. This was a completely transparent arm's-length transaction. If you wanted to know who owned Apex Holdings, you should have hired your own legal counsel to conduct basic due diligence. But you were too cheap and too arrogant to do so." Sydney collapsed back into her chair, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull in oxygen. Thomas buried his face in his hands, letting out a low, pathetic groan. The walls were rapidly closing in on them. But Brenda, ever the narcissistic aristocrat, suddenly stiffened her spine. A twisted, triumphant sneer spread across her face. She looked around the table, seemingly finding a silver lining in her own delusion. "So what?" Brenda spat, laughing a harsh, mocking laugh. "So what if you are Apex Holdings? You went through all this theatrical, ridiculous nonsense just to bail us out. You still bought the house, you absolute idiot. You just wired $2.8 million of your own money to pay off Jamal's mess. You saved us from foreclosure and handed us a $300,000 profit. I always knew you were desperate for our attention, Nora, but paying millions of dollars just to sit at the head of a table is pathetic. Hand over the surplus check so we can leave." I looked at my mother. I looked at the utter contempt in her eyes, the sheer arrogance of a woman who thought she had somehow still won. I did not get angry. I did not raise my voice. I simply smiled. It was a cold, calculated, predatory smile. It was the smile of a woman watching a trap snap entirely shut. I turned my head slightly toward my attorney. "David," I said softly, "please explain the math to my mother." David opened the second binder, pulling out a freshly printed stack of bank documents. He pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and looked at the family like they were specimens under a microscope. "Let us talk about your debt, Brenda." David began, his tone clinical and devastating. The $2.5 million home equity loan Jamal took out was not the only encumbrance on this property. Your husband had quietly refinanced the primary mortgage 3 years ago, borrowing against the equity to fund your country club lifestyle. The total combined debt held by the bank on the Crestwood estate was actually $4.9 million. Thomas let out a choked gasp, realizing his secret financial failures were being dragged into the open. Apex Holdings purchased the property for $2.8 million. David continued relentlessly. We executed what is legally known as a short sale. Because the bank was facing a messy, protracted public foreclosure, they agreed to take our immediate cash offer and forgive the remaining balance of the debt. They wrote off over $2 million to clear the title. Jamal frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. Yeah, so what? The bank wrote it off. We are clear. You are clear of the bank, David corrected him sharply. But you are not clear of the federal government. Yesterday, in your desperation to force this deal through after the foundation crack was discovered, you signed a highly specific addendum. That addendum explicitly indemnified my client from any tax obligations and transferred 100% of the tax liability for the debt clearance onto the sellers. David pulled a single, terrifying document from the stack and slid it to the center of the marble table. This is IRS Form 1099C. David announced, his voice dropping an anvil on the room. Cancellation of debt. Under federal tax law, when a financial institution forgives a debt of this magnitude, the Internal Revenue Service does not consider it a gift. They consider it earned income. The room went deathly still. The realization was a physical blow. Because the house sold for far less than what was owed. The bank is legally forgiving over $2 million in debt, David explained, delivering the final fatal stroke. However, under the specific clause Jamal blindly forced your family to sign, you are entirely responsible for the tax burden of that forgiveness. The IRS will tax that forgiven $2 million as if you earned it in cold hard cash this year. You are about to be handed a tax bill for hundreds of thousands of dollars, and federal taxes cannot be erased by a standard bankruptcy. I stood up from my leather chair. I walked over to the large glass whiteboard mounted on the far wall of the conference room. I picked up a black dry erase marker and uncapped it. The sharp squeak of the marker against the glass was the only sound in the room as I began to write out the exact math of their destruction. I wanted them to see the numbers in giant, undeniable print. I wrote the total debt, $4.9 million. Below that, I wrote the purchase price, $2.8 million. I drew a thick black line and wrote the difference, $2.1 million. Then I factored in the accrued interest and bank penalty fees that had compounded over the last few months, bringing the final forgiven amount to exactly what David had stated. You were forgiven roughly $2.2 million in debt today, I explained, tapping the tip of the marker against the glass board. I turned to face them. As David just pointed out, the Internal Revenue Service views that forgiven debt as ordinary income. You are now in the highest federal tax bracket. Add in the New York State income tax, and your total tax liability on this single transaction is approximately 40%. I turned back to the board and wrote the final number. It took up half the glass, $900,000. You now owe the IRS nearly $900,000 in cold, hard cash, I said, my voice echoing off the glass walls. And before you start planning your bankruptcy strategy, let me save you the legal consultation fees. Income taxes resulting from a 1099C cancellation of debt generally cannot be discharged in a standard Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The federal government does not care about your crypto investments or your country club memberships. They will freeze your bank accounts. They will garnish your wages. They will seize any assets you try to hide. You thought you were walking away with $250,000 in profit. Instead, you are nearly $1 million in debt to the most unforgiving collection agency on the planet. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The reality of the numbers on the board finally bypassed Jamal's monumental ego and struck him right in the chest. His entire fake empire was completely obliterated in a matter of seconds. He was not just broke. He was federally indebted for the rest of his natural life. Jamal snapped. A primal, furious scream ripped from his throat. He vaulted out of his chair, launching his entire body across the wide marble conference table directly toward me. His hands were curled into fists, his face twisted into a mask of absolute violent rage. He knocked over crystal water glasses and scattered legal binders across the floor. He never even made it past the center of the table. Before David or Bennett could even react, the heavy glass doors of the conference room burst open. The two massive private security contractors I had hired specifically for this closing rushed into the room. They grabbed Jamal by the shoulders, yanked him backward off the marble table, and slammed him hard against the glass wall. Jamal thrashed wildly, screaming obscenities and kicking at the floor, but the guards pinned him effortlessly, completely neutralizing the threat. "Let me go!" Jamal roared, his voice cracking with panic and fury. "She set us up. This is a setup. Thomas, tell them." But Thomas was completely unhinged. My father leaped to his feet, his face purple with rage, but his anger was not directed at me. He turned entirely on Jamal. "You told me to sign it!" Thomas screamed, his voice raw and shaking. "You stood in my house and promised me you knew what you were doing. You said it was just corporate boilerplate. You arrogant, stupid child. You blew my money on a scam, and then you forced me to sign my own death warrant. You destroyed my family. You destroyed my life." "I did not force you to do anything," Jamal shouted back, struggling against the security guards. "You signed the paper, old man. You are the one who took out the first mortgage. Do not try to pin your financial failures on me. You were broke long before I got here." As the two men screamed at each other, tearing each other apart in the middle of the title office, Sydney began to hyperventilate. She was still sitting in her chair, gripping her chest, her carefully applied makeup running down her face as tears streamed from her eyes. She was gasping for air in short, frantic bursts. Her platinum credit cards, her luxury cars, her penthouse in Miami, everything was gone. She was married to a fraud who was about to be investigated by the federal government, and she had absolutely no skills to survive in the real world. Then the most shocking thing of all happened. Brenda, the woman who had spent my entire life looking down her nose at me, the woman who had called me her biggest disappointment just 2 years ago, physically collapsed. Her legs gave out and she fell to her knees right there on the expensive corporate carpet. She crawled forward slightly, reaching her trembling hands out toward me. Her aristocratic facade was completely destroyed, replaced by the pathetic weeping shell of a woman who had finally run out of other people's money. "Nora, please." Brenda begged, her voice a high-pitched, desperate wail. "Please, I am begging you. You cannot do this to us. We are your family. I am your mother. You are my real daughter. Please just tear up the addendum. Cancel the contract. We will do anything you want. We will give you the house. Just do not leave us with this tax bill. I cannot go to prison. I cannot be poor, Nora, please." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman kneeling on the floor in her ruined designer clothes. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, no hesitation. The emotional manipulation that used to control me had completely lost its power. I looked my mother right in the eyes. "I am not family. Remember I said," my voice barely above a whisper yet, carrying the weight of an absolute final judgment. "I am just the buyer." I turned my back on her weeping form. I walked back to my seat at the head of the table. I picked up my heavy fountain pen, flipped the binder to the final authorization page, and signed my name on the wire transfer release. The ink dried instantly. The money was sent. The trap was permanently sealed. The house was mine. The sharp electronic chime from Mr. Campbell's laptop cut through the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. The escrow agent adjusted his glasses and looked at his screen. "The wire transfer has officially cleared," Mr. Campbell announced, his voice entirely professional, completely ignoring the absolute psychological devastation unfolding across the marble table. "The funds have been dispersed to the seller's account, and the title is now legally recorded in the name of Apex Holdings, LLC. The transaction is complete." I did not smile. I did not celebrate. I simply reached into my black leather briefcase and pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper. I placed it flat on the table and pushed it across the smooth marble surface with my index fingers. It glided silently, stopping right in front of my father. "That is a formal 72-hour notice to vacate the premises," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet sobbing of my mother. "You have until 9 o'clock on Friday morning to remove your personal belongings from my property. Any items left inside the house or on the grounds after that exact time will be considered legally abandoned and disposed of by my demolition crew." Thomas stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. The blood that had rushed to his face during his screaming match with Jamal suddenly drained away, leaving him looking frail, old, and utterly defeated. But his deeply ingrained pride, the toxic entitlement he had carried his entire life, refused to die quietly. He slammed his fist onto the table, a weak, trembling gesture of a king who had already lost his crown. "You cannot do this to us, Nora," Thomas shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I am your father. I built that house. We have lived there for over 30 years. You cannot expect us to pack up an entire estate in 3 days. By law, we are entitled to a standard 30-day post-closing occupancy period. Even the most ruthless corporate buyers allow the sellers time to transition. You will give us 30 days, or I will file an injunction against this sale." I leaned back in my leather executive chair and crossed my arms. I looked at David, who simply shook his head in amusement. "You are in no position to issue threats, Thomas," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. "And you are entirely incorrect about your legal entitlements. You would have been granted a 30-day occupancy period under the standard Apex Holdings contract. However, your brilliant son-in-law decided to negotiate on your behalf." I shifted my gaze to Jamal, who was still pinned against the glass wall by my private security guards. He was sweating profusely, his expensive velvet jacket ruined his eyes, darting frantically around the room. Jamal was so desperate to get his hands on the cash surplus that he aggressively demanded an expedited closing, I explained, making sure every word landed like a physical blow. He explicitly waived the standard 30-day seller in possession clause in exchange for a 14-day closing window and immediate wire disbursement. He traded your housing security so he could rush to Miami and pretend to be a billionaire. You gave up your right to stay in that house the second you let him sign the addendum. The 72-hour notice is perfectly legal and fully enforceable by the county sheriff. Sydney let out a piercing, hysterical gasp. "We cannot pack a $5 million house in 3 days. We do not have any movers booked. We do not even have boxes. Where are we supposed to go?" I looked at my sister, the golden child who had never lifted a finger to help anyone but herself. "I suggest you rent a moving truck and start packing immediately, Sydney. You have a lot of designer clothes to fit into a very small storage unit." Thomas stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Fine," he snarled, his eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and profound humiliation. "We will pack our things. We will take every single piece of furniture, every appliance, every fixture I ever paid for. I will strip that house down to the absolute studs before I leave it to you." I anticipated this exact reaction, the scorched earth threat of a narcissist who has lost control. I sat forward, resting my elbows on the table, and narrowed my eyes. "Let me make one thing absolutely clear," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "Yesterday morning, my head of acquisitions walked through every single room of that estate wearing a high-definition body camera. I have time-stamped recorded video evidence of the exact condition and inventory of the Crestwood estate as it stood 24 hours ago." I paused, letting the reality of my surveillance sink into their panicked minds. "If a single copper pipe is missing," I continued, "if a single appliance is removed, if the custom chandeliers are taken down, if you punch a hole in the drywall, scratch the hardwood floors out of spite, or if even a single light bulb is missing when I walk through those front doors on Friday morning, I will not hesitate. I will personally file civil lawsuits against each of you for destruction of private property. And then I will press criminal charges for felony vandalism and theft. I have the corporate legal team to keep you buried in court for the next 10 years. Do not test me. You will take your clothes, your personal electronics, and your furniture. You will leave the fixtures. You will leave the house exactly as I bought it." My father opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. The sheer overwhelming weight of his defeat crushed his vocal cords. He had no leverage. He had no power. He was completely at my mercy, and he knew I possessed absolutely none for him. "We are done here," I announced, standing up and buttoning my suit jacket. "Gentlemen, please escort the former owners out of the building. Make sure they do not cause a scene in the lobby." The two massive security guards released Jamal from the wall, grabbing him firmly by the upper arms. They corralled Thomas, Brenda, and Sydney toward the heavy glass doors. Brenda was weeping uncontrollably, her face buried in her hands as she stumbled blindly forward. Sydney was clutching Jamal's arm, but he completely ignored her, his face locked in a blank, traumatized stare. Thomas walked with his head bowed, his shoulders slumped, carrying the invisible weight of $1 million tax debt and absolute social ruin. They were marched out of the conference room and down the long carpeted hallway. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind them, cutting off the sound of my mother's sobbing. I stood alone in the quiet conference room with David and Bennett. I walked slowly over to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the bustling Manhattan streets far below. I looked down at the tiny moving figures on the pavement. A few moments later, I spotted my family emerging from the lobby doors of the title company. Even from 20 stories up, I could see the absolute chaos unfolding on the sidewalk. Thomas violently shoved Jamal, pointing an accusatory finger in his face. Jamal shoved him back, throwing his hands up in the air as if trying to deflect the blame. Sydney was standing between them, screaming at her husband, while Brenda leaned against the side of the building, physically unable to support her own weight. Pedestrians were stopping to stare at the wealthy family tearing each other to pieces in broad daylight. They were turning on each other exactly as I knew they would. The money had been the only glue holding their toxic dynamic together, and now the money was gone, replaced by a massive, unavoidable debt. I stood at the window watching them fight on the street, my reflection ghostly and still in the thick glass. The transaction was complete and the house belonged to me. But as I watched my father raise his fist at the man who ruined him, I knew the real fallout, the true agonizing destruction of their false empire, was only just beginning. 2 days later, the sky over upstate New York broke open, unleashing a torrential, freezing downpour. It was Thursday morning. They had exactly 24 hours left before my eviction notice expired. I sat comfortably in the driver's seat of my sleek black SUV parked discreetly at the very end of the long cobblestone driveway of the Crestwood estate. The engine was running silently, the heater keeping the cabin perfectly warm, and the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers framed the absolute chaos unfolding in front of the mansion. The scene was a masterpiece of poetic justice. Because they were facing a catastrophic $900,000 federal tax liability and had absolutely no liquid cash left to their names, hiring a premium white-glove moving company was entirely out of the question. They were forced to do the manual labor themselves. A beat-up, brightly colored rental box truck was parked awkwardly in front of the grand oak doors, looking ridiculously out of place against the backdrop of the $5 million property. Jamal and Thomas were completely soaked to the bone. Thomas was wearing a ruined polo shirt and khaki golf trousers that were now plastered to his legs with mud. Jamal had traded his velvet dinner jackets for a designer tracksuit that was rapidly being destroyed by the freezing rain. They were struggling to push a massive solid oak antique armoire up the slick metal loading ramp of the moving truck. The heavy piece of furniture was slipping, and the physical strain was visibly breaking my father. "Push it from the bottom, you idiot!" Thomas screamed over the sound of the pouring rain, his face red with exertion and fury. "If you let it slip, it is going to crush my leg." "I am pushing!" Jamal yelled back, his expensive sneakers sliding uselessly on the wet metal ramp. "This thing weighs a ton. Why did you not leave this garbage inside the house?" "Because it is worth $10,000, Thomas roared, his voice cracking. "And thanks to you, I need every single penny to pay a defense lawyer. Push the damn cabinet." Up on the covered portico, Brenda and Sydney were completely useless. Brenda was huddled under a large golf umbrella, shivering in a cashmere cardigan, shouting contradictory instructions at the two men while refusing to step out into the rain. Sydney was making frantic, pathetic trips back and forth from the front door to the truck, carrying individual designer shoeboxes to keep them from getting wet. It was a humiliating, grueling display of a family that had spent decades relying on other people's money, now forced to face the physical weight of their own consequences. I took a sip of my coffee, perfectly content to watch them load the truck all morning. But the universe had a much more spectacular finale planned for Jamal's fake empire. Through the heavy rain, I saw two dark, unmarked Ford Explorers turn sharply onto the street. They did not slow down. They bypassed my parked SUV entirely, their tires kicking up massive sprays of water as they accelerated up the long cobblestone driveway. They slammed on their brakes right behind the rented moving truck, blocking it in completely. The doors of the Explorers flew open simultaneously. 5 men and women wearing dark windbreakers stepped out into the storm. The bold yellow letters printed across their backs were unmistakable even from a distance. FBI. And right beside them, agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Jamal looked up from the metal ramp. The moment he saw the federal agents marching toward him, he dropped his side of the antique armoire. The massive oak cabinet slammed down onto the ramp with a deafening crack, pinning Thomas's ankle for a split second before sliding violently back down onto the driveway and shattering into the mud. Thomas collapsed shouting in pain, but Jamal did not even look back at his father-in-law. The offshore accounts had finally been traced. The crypto token investors had realized their money was gone, and the massive class action fraud lawsuit they had filed earlier that week had triggered an immediate federal criminal investigation. Jamal was staring at decades in federal prison for wire fraud and grand larceny. Jamal's survival instinct was entirely built on cowardice. He turned around and bolted. He ran straight past a screaming Sydney on the porch, shoved his way through the grand front doors and sprinted into the house. He was making a desperate, idiotic dash for the back terrace, hoping to escape through the expansive gardens and into the woods behind the estate. Federal agents breached the house right behind him, their boots tracking mud all over the foyer. I watched the pursuit unfold from my vantage point. Less than 30 seconds later, Jamal came bursting out of the rear conservatory doors. But the manicured lawn was completely saturated from the downpour. As he sprinted across the grass, his expensive sneakers lost all traction. He slipped, arms flailing wildly, and face planted directly into the thick, freezing mud of the Crestwood estate. 2 federal agents were on him in an instant. They drove a knee into his back, burying his face deeper into the mud, and wrenched his arms behind him. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed all the way to the front of the property. They dragged Jamal back around the side of the house, hauling him toward the unmarked vehicles. He was unrecognizable. The arrogant, untouchable crypto billionaire was now a shivering, sobbing mess, completely covered in dark brown sludge. His designer tracksuit ruined his wrists, bound tightly behind his back. Sydney dropped the 2 shoeboxes she was holding. They tumbled down the stone steps, spilling expensive heels onto the wet pavement. She screamed hysterically, rushing forward and grabbing at the agents' jackets, begging them to stop sobbing, that there had been a mistake. An agent gently but firmly pushed her back, ordering her to stay clear. They shoved Jamal into the back of the Explorer, slammed the heavy door shut, and drove away, the red and blue lights flashing silently through the downpour. Sydney was left standing completely alone in the center of the driveway. The rain plastered her blonde hair to her face. Her husband was gone. Her money was gone. Her home was gone. She slowly turned her head, looking through the sheets of rain down the long stretch of cobblestones. Her eyes locked onto my black SUV parked at the end of the gates. She could see my silhouette through the windshield. She knew I had watched the entire thing. She took a step toward me, raising her hand, her mouth open in a silent, desperate plea for her big sister to somehow fix this, to save her one last time. I looked at her weeping, drenched figure. I pressed the button on my door panel. The dark, heavily tinted window rolled up smoothly, completely erasing her from my view. I shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the curb. A week later, the Crestwood estate was completely unrecognizable, not from decay, but from resurrection. The massive moving truck was gone, the mud had washed away, and in their place stood a fleet of heavy-duty commercial vehicles, bearing the crisp green and silver logo of Vanguard Acquisitions. I stood on the grand front porch, holding a steaming cup of coffee, listening to the magnificent, echoing sounds of demolition. My construction crews were systematically gutting the interior. The heavy, dark mahogany panels that had absorbed decades of my mother's toxic complaints were being ripped out and tossed into industrial dumpsters. We were replacing them with sustainable bamboo flooring, installing massive, energy-efficient windows to flood the rooms with natural light, and outfitting the roof with a state-of-the-art solar array. The crumbling symbol of my family's hollow vanity was being physically dismantled and transformed into Vanguard's premier eco-friendly corporate retreat. It felt like breathing pure oxygen for the very first time. 10 miles away, my parents were breathing stale, recycled air. The lavish lifestyle they had desperately tried to protect had violently collapsed into a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The contrast was absolute. Instead of 50 acres of manicured lawns, they had a small concrete balcony overlooking a noisy intersection. Instead of a grand foyer, they had a narrow hallway that constantly smelled of cheap cooking oil and bleach. Thomas, a man who had spent his entire life commanding respect at elite country clubs, was now forced to listen to his upstairs neighbors arguing through the paper-thin ceiling every single night. But Brenda was entirely incapable of accepting her new reality. Her narcissism demanded a scapegoat, and she immediately went to work trying to construct one. She realized she had absolutely no leverage left with me, so she resorted to the oldest manipulation tactic in the toxic family playbook. She deployed the flying monkeys. She spent her days sitting on a cheap, uncomfortable sofa, calling every aunt, uncle, and distant cousin in our extended family network. She wept into the phone, spinning a masterful, entirely fabricated narrative. She claimed I had used my corporate wealth to maliciously steal the family estate out from under them through a predatory legal loophole. She cried that Jamal had simply made a minor accounting error and was being unfairly targeted by the government. She begged the extended family to intervene, hoping to use their collective social pressure to shame me into handing over hundreds of thousands of dollars to pay for Jamal's federal defense attorneys and to upgrade their miserable living situation. By Wednesday afternoon, my phone began to light up. The text messages from my aunts and uncles rolled in, dripping with self-righteous indignation. "How can you let your own mother sleep in a place like that?" one aunt wrote. "You have millions of dollars and your sister is practically homeless while her husband sits in a federal holding cell," an uncle chimed in. "Family is supposed to forgive, Nora. You need to write them a check today and fix this before God punishes your greed," wrote a deeply religious cousin. They were all operating under the false assumption that I was a bitter, vindictive daughter, punishing my loving parents over a simple misunderstanding. They expected me to defend myself. They expected me to draft long, emotional paragraphs explaining my side of the story, giving them the power to judge my actions. I did not give them a single word of justification. I was sitting at my desk in my Manhattan office, finalizing the architectural blueprints for the estate renovation. I picked up my phone and navigated to the massive extended family group chat. It had over 40 members. I had kept it muted for years, ignoring the endless streams of holiday photos and passive-aggressive gossip. Now it was the perfect stage for an execution. I took screenshots of two highly specific documents from my legal files. The first image was a pristine high-resolution scan of the original trust amendment from the lawyer's office 2 years ago. I used my phone's photo editor to draw a bright red circle around the paragraph where Thomas and Brenda voluntarily and legally completely disinherited me, transferring 100% of their $5 million asset to Jamal and Sydney. The second image was a bank receipt I had pulled during my financial investigation. It was the receipt for Jamal's solid gold Rolex. I drew a red circle around the date, proving it was purchased with my father's credit card during the exact same month my parents had told the family they were experiencing severe financial hardship. I uploaded both images to the group chat. I typed a single ironclad sentence below them. "They bet the entire family legacy on a federal criminal and lost, and now they want you to pay for it." I hit send. I watched the two images upload successfully, delivering the undeniable documented truth directly to 40 different phones simultaneously. I did not wait to see the typing bubbles appear. I did not care about their shocked reactions or their sudden apologies. I tapped the settings icon in the top right corner of the screen and pressed Leave Group. A prompt asked if I was sure I wanted to permanently delete the conversation and exit. I pressed Confirm. The silence that followed was absolute. I would learn later from a former industry contact that the group chat explosion was utterly catastrophic for my parents. The extended family, people who prized their own financial security and social standing above all else, were completely horrified by the hard evidence. They saw the legal document proving my parents had viciously cut me out of the family by choice. They saw the receipt proving Jamal was bleeding them dry while they enabled him. The narrative of the victimized parents evaporated instantly, replaced by the ugly reality of their extreme greed and stupidity. The fallout was swift and merciless. When Brenda tried to call her sister the next morning to ask for a loan, the call went straight to voicemail. When Thomas reached out to his brother for a character reference for Jamal's upcoming bail hearing, he was entirely ignored. Sydney tried to organize a crowdfunding campaign for her husband's legal defense, and not a single family member donated a dime. They were exposed, and because of that exposure, they were entirely abandoned. The extended family completely cut off Thomas, Brenda, and Sydney to protect themselves from the financial blast radius of a federal fraud investigation. Their isolation was now absolute. They were trapped in a tiny apartment with no money, no social standing, and nobody left to blame but each other. It had been exactly 3 weeks since Jamal was dragged face first through the mud of the Crestwood estate by federal agents. The dust from his spectacular arrest was beginning to settle, but the financial crater he left behind was enormous and still smoking. I was in the middle of a high-level quarterly earnings review in my top-floor executive suite when the polished black phone on my desk buzzed softly. It was Marcus, my head of security, stationed in the ground-floor lobby. He informed me that my sister was currently standing at the reception desk, looking highly distressed and refusing to leave the premises until she spoke with me directly. I did not invite her up to my office. I did not want her anywhere near the sanctuary I had built for myself. I told Marcus to have her wait by the front windows. I opened a file on my computer, printed a single sheet of paper, and took the private executive elevator down to the ground floor. When the steel doors slid open, the sight in the gleaming sunlit marble lobby of Vanguard Acquisitions was almost jarring. Sydney was pacing back and forth near the towering glass entrance. The golden child of our family had been completely stripped of her gold. She was wearing a plain gray sweater and dark faded jeans, an outfit completely devoid of the heavy designer labels and flashing diamond jewelry she used to weaponize against me. Her blonde hair, which was usually blown out to perfection, was pulled back in a messy, careless knot. The dark, hollow circles under her eyes told the stark story of sleepless nights, endless interrogations by federal prosecutors, and the terrifying, crushing realization that her entire life had been a massive lie. She looked up and saw me approaching. Her eyes immediately welled up with tears, and she practically ran across the marble floor toward me. "Nora, please." Sydney started, her voice echoing slightly in the vast, pristine lobby. "I did not know where else to go. I am so sorry to just show up here like this, but I am desperate." She reached out, attempting to grab my hands in a show of sisterly affection, but I smoothly stepped back. I kept my posture rigid, establishing a firm, impenetrable physical boundary between us. "The federal prosecutors froze all of our joint bank accounts." Sydney continued, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "They seized the Porsche. They took my designer bags. They even came to the apartment and confiscated the jewelry Jamal bought me over the last 2 years because they said it was purchased with stolen investor funds. I have absolutely nothing left, Nora. I am sleeping on Mom and Dad's sofa in that horrible, cramped little apartment, and it is a living nightmare. They do nothing but scream at each other all day long." I stood perfectly still, letting her hyperventilate. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not offer her a word of comfort. I was manipulated. "Nora," Sydney pleaded, pivoting seamlessly into the victim narrative she had undoubtedly been practicing all morning. "Jamal lied to me about everything. He told me he was a financial genius, and Mom and Dad pushed me to marry him because they wanted his money and his status. They used me to elevate their own social standing, just like they used you for your money. We are both victims here. You have to understand that. I need a job. I need to get out of that apartment. A consulting role, an executive assistant position, anything you have open. I know you pay your senior staff 6-figure salaries. I am smart, I can learn the business. You are my sister. You cannot just leave me with nothing." I listened to her entire pathetic speech without interrupting. It was an absolute masterclass in deflection and cognitive dissonance. Even now, completely destitute and standing in the wreckage of her own arrogance, she refused to take a single ounce of genuine responsibility. "You are not a victim, Sydney," I said, my voice cold level and echoing sharply in the quiet marble hall. "You were a highly willing participant. You loved Jamal's money when you thought it was real, and you never once asked where it came from, as long as it kept you dripping in diamonds and luxury cars." Sydney opened her mouth to protest, but I held up my hand, silencing her instantly. "Do not stand in my lobby and pretend we are the same," I continued relentlessly. "You stood in that expensive Manhattan restaurant and expected me to pay your $8,000 champagne bill while Jamal mocked my career. You sat on the staircase of our childhood home and recorded a viral video calling me a greedy, estranged monster. You happily watched Mom and Dad erase my name from the family trust so you could inherit everything. You only care about sisterhood now because the federal government seized your assets and I am the last remaining ATM in the city." Tears spilled over her eyelashes and ran down her cheeks, but I knew they were tears of self-pity, not remorse. "But Nora, what am I supposed to do?" she whimpered. "I have no income. I cannot survive like this." I looked down at the single sheet of paper I had carried down from my office. I held it out toward her. "Accountability does not come with a six-figure corporate salary and a corner office," I told her bluntly. "I am not hiring you, Sydney. You have absolutely no corporate skills, you have zero work ethic, and your husband is currently the center of a massive federal fraud investigation. You are a walking liability to my firm." Sydney hesitantly reached out and took the piece of paper. She looked down at it, her brow furrowing in confusion. It was a printed list of 5 local temporary staffing agencies, places that specialized in placing entry-level administrative assistants, retail workers, and hourly warehouse staff. "What is this?" she asked, her voice dropping into a tone of genuine disgust as she read the names of the agencies. "Nora, these are minimum wage temp jobs. I cannot work in a retail store or answer phones in a cubicle. I am a vice president's daughter." "You are the wife of a federal inmate who currently lives on a sofa," I corrected her sharply. "That list is exactly what starting over looks like. I suggest you call the first agency on the list before noon because the rent on Mom and Dad's apartment is due next week and I highly doubt they have the cash to cover it." Sydney stared at the list of temp agencies, her lip trembling uncontrollably as the absolute crushing reality of her new life finally set in. There were no shortcuts left. There were no golden parachutes. There was no one left to manipulate. She was going to have to work for a living just like everyone else she had spent her entire life looking down upon. "You always wanted to be the only one who mattered to them," I said quietly, looking her dead in the eye and delivering the final devastating truth. "Congratulations, Sydney, you are all they have left." I did not wait for a response. I turned around, walked back to the polished steel doors of the private executive elevator, and pressed the call button. The doors slid open instantly. I stepped inside and turned back to face the lobby. The heavy doors smoothly slid shut, leaving Sydney standing completely alone in the massive corporate hall holding a piece of paper that was worth far more than her entire previous life. 6 months slipped by with the relentless productive speed of a machine operating at peak efficiency. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in early spring when my private driver turned the SUV onto the familiar cobblestone driveway of the Crestwood property. The heavy iron gates that used to hang crookedly on their hinges, groaning every time they opened, had been entirely replaced by a sleek, modernized security checkpoint. I rolled my window down, returning the friendly, respectful nod of my security detail, and looked up at the physical manifestation of my absolute victory. The estate was completely reborn. The crumbling, oppressive brick facade had been restored and accented with massive, clean panels of smart glass. The slate roof that had once leaked rainwater onto my family's expensive, unearned Persian rugs was now completely covered in high-capacity solar tiles. We had retrofitted the entire $5 million property into a state-of-the-art, zero-emissions corporate headquarters for Vanguard Acquisitions. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked through the grand front entrance. The transformation was breathtaking. The dark, heavy mahogany paneling that had always made the foyer feel like a suffocating tomb had been entirely gutted. In its place, my architects had installed soaring walls of sustainably sourced bamboo and massive skylights that flooded the interior with bright, warm sunlight. The space that had once echoed with my mother's bitter complaints, my sister's whining, and my father's hollow boasts, was now alive with the hum of actual tangible productivity. I walked through the open concept bullpen that used to be the formal dining room, where my family once sat and mocked my ambition. A team of brilliant, sharp young analysts and senior acquisition managers now looked up from their dual monitors. They did not look at me with the contempt or conditional tolerance I had endured my entire life. They looked at me with genuine earned respect. They saw a founder, a leader, and a visionary who had built a $30 million firm from the ground up and protected it with ruthless precision. "Good morning, Nora," my lead financial analyst called out, handing me a freshly printed market trend report as I walked by. I smiled a real unburdened smile and thanked him. I continued down the hall, passing the rear conservatory. The shattered stone floor that Jamal had desperately tried to hide under a rug was entirely repaired, poured over with polished, heated concrete. It was now an employee wellness lounge filled with green plants and quiet collaboration spaces. Walking these halls no longer triggered the old familiar knot of anxiety in my chest. The ghosts of gaslighting, emotional abuse, and financial manipulation had been completely exorcised by the relentless light of success. I had not just bought my childhood home, I had completely purged it of its poison. I made my way up the floating glass staircase to my private executive suite, which occupied the exact footprint of my parents' former master bedroom. The heavy velvet drapes were gone, replaced by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling manicured green space in the back. I sat down at my desk, a beautiful slab of reclaimed wood, and opened my laptop. Next to my keyboard sat a neat stack of morning correspondence organized by my executive assistant. Right on top of the pile was a thick envelope bearing the official seal of the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of New York. I picked up a silver letter opener and sliced the envelope open. I pulled out the dense legal documents and scanned the first page. It was an official notice of filing. Thomas, Brenda, and Sydney had officially declared Chapter 13 bankruptcy. According to the attached legal summary, the Internal Revenue Service had finally moved to garnish their wages from whatever menial jobs they had managed to secure. The government had frozen their remaining meager bank accounts to collect on the massive $900,000 tax debt stemming from the cancellation of the Crestwood mortgage. The bankruptcy filing was a desperate, flailing attempt to halt the immediate federal collections and buy themselves a few more months of miserable survival. The documents showed a brutal reality. They were drowning in legal fees from Jamal's criminal defense, and Sydney was listed as a co-debtor, completely tethered to the sinking ship of her husband's fraud. The system had finally caught up to their lifelong grift. The illusion of their untouchable wealth had been permanently shattered by the cold, unforgiving machinery of the federal government. I read the names of my parents and my sister listed under the heading of debtors. A year ago, seeing their names on a document like this might have sparked a fleeting moment of pity or a toxic sense of obligation to swoop in and rescue them. Now, sitting in the empire I built with my own hands, I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional cord had been cauterized and completely healed over. I did not even bother to read the rest of the filing. I did not care what their restructuring plan was or how they planned to pay the rent on their cramped apartment. I folded the thick stack of legal documents in half, leaned over, and fed them directly into the heavy-duty paper shredder beneath my desk. The machine hummed aggressively, chewing the last remnants of my toxic family history into tiny, illegible strips of confetti. Just as the shredder clicked off, the glass door to my office swung open. My executive assistant walked in, carrying a massive, heavy leather binder. She set it down squarely in the center of my desk. "The preliminary scouting reports just came in on the downtown commercial portfolio," she announced, her eyes bright with professional excitement. "It is exactly the kind of distressed asset you were looking for. 3 neglected office high-rises, heavily leveraged, terrible management. The current owners are desperate to liquidate before the banks step in." I reached out and rested my hand on the cool leather cover of the binder. I looked out the massive windows out over the green, thriving estate that I now owned completely free and clear. The past was dead buried under layers of legal concrete and shattered illusions. I opened the binder to the first page, my eyes scanning the multi-million-dollar numbers. "Let us schedule a meeting with their legal team for tomorrow morning," I said, a sharp, predatory smile spreading across my face. "The empire is growing." I closed the heavy leather binder and left my office. I walked down the floating glass staircase and pushed open the massive doors leading out to the newly built terrace. The crisp spring air hit my face, carrying the scent of fresh rain and the blooming hydrangeas my landscaping team had just planted. I walked to the edge of the terrace and rested my hands on the sleek metal railing. I looked out over the 50 acres of the Crestwood estate, my property legally and ruthlessly reclaimed. For the first time in my 34 years of life, standing on this ground did not make me feel small. It did not make me feel like an outsider, a disappointment, or a liability. It made me feel invincible. Society constantly force feeds us the American myth that blood is thicker than water. We are taught from a very young age that family is everything, that you must always forgive, always compromise, and always keep the door open, no matter how badly the people inside treat you. But that is a dangerous, manipulated lie. Toxic families weaponize that exact concept of blind loyalty. They use the word family as a shield to deflect accountability and as a weapon to extract your wealth, your energy, and your sanity. They demand endless grace for their worst mistakes while offering absolutely zero respect for your greatest achievements. My parents and my sister expected me to bleed myself dry to keep their illusion of superiority alive. They believed that because we shared the same genetics, they were inherently entitled to the fruits of my labor. And the moment I stopped being a convenient source of funding, the moment I chose to build my own life instead of financing theirs, they did not just discard me. They tried to publicly and legally destroy me. They sat in a polished conference room, smiled, and completely erased me from their legacy, fully believing I would simply walk away in tears and accept my place at the bottom of their hierarchy. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They assumed I was playing by their emotional rules. I was not. They tried to use the law to erase me. I used the law to hold them accountable. The most dangerous woman in the room isn't the one screaming. It's the one reading the fine print while everyone else is talking. While Jamal was bragging loudly about his fake crypto millions, and my mother was throwing lavish parties on borrowed time, I was reading the tax code. While Sydney was crying on social media, playing the victim, I was studying commercial liability addendums. I did not waste my energy fighting them in the mud of public opinion. I did not scream, I did not cry, and I did not beg for their love. I simply built a fortress of absolute untouchable financial literacy, and I waited for them to walk right into the trap their own arrogance had set. When you finally set a hard boundary with toxic people, especially financial boundaries, they will inevitably call you the villain. They will spin the narrative to anyone who will listen, claiming you are cold, ruthless, and ungrateful. You have to be willing to let them. You have to make total peace with being the villain in their fabricated story, because it is the only way you get to be the hero in your own actual life. I gladly wear the villain label my mother gave me. It is a badge of honor. It means I am no longer easily manipulated. It means my boundaries are working. Looking out over the manicured lawns and the state-of-the-art solar arrays powering my company, I realized that true wealth is not about the cars you drive or the designer clothes you wear. True wealth is the absolute freedom to decide who gets to sit at your table. It is the power to look at a room full of people who mistreated you and say no without a single ounce of guilt or hesitation. I took a deep breath, letting the clean, quiet energy of the estate fill my lungs. The noise of my childhood was permanently gone. The generational trauma that had infected this land had been completely uprooted and thrown away in the dumpsters of my demolition crews. Sometimes the only way to heal a generational curse is to buy it out and bulldoze it. Have you ever had to draw a ruthless financial or legal boundary with toxic family members? Did they call you the villain when you stopped letting them use you? Tell me your story in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and remember, protect your peace and always protect your assets.